In this episode of The Tolleson Life, we visit the Castillo de San Marcos Fort, the oldest masonry fort in America, located in the oldest city in America, St. Augustine, Florida. She was undefeated in battle, winning every siege waged against her. Today I'll take you around, inside, and atop this old battle-tested relic of history, and learn how she stood as undefeated champion of the colonial era. Come with me now as we explore the Castillo de San Marcos Fort. Hello everyone, if this is your first time to our channel, welcome. And to all of our wonderful subscribers and regular viewers, welcome back. As we just heard, the Castillo Fort was never taken by military force. However, St. Augustine did have 9 other forts prior to the Castillo that did fail. Some burned and some simply destroyed by weather. So what was it about the Castillo Fort that kept her from ever losing in battle, not to mention how she has stood the test of time, being the only remaining 17th century fort in North America? Well, stay tuned, because in this video, we're going to see for ourselves how she survived. And hey, if you like this video, don't forget to smash that like button. And I hope you'll consider subscribing if you haven't done so already. So now, let's travel to the Castillo de San Marcos Fort. And as with most of our adventures, it begins with us hopping in the RV, our Tiffin open road. And shortly after arriving at our home base, the Ocean Grove RV Resort, we were on our way to see this piece of history, which was only about 5 minutes away. Now we arrive. The fort took some 23 years to build, completed in 1695. Built by the Spanish to protect their interests in what was then called La Florida. With the discovery and use of the Gulf Stream by the Spanish treasure fleets, it became important to establish a military outpost to keep rival powers and pirates from threatening Spanish commerce. The designers and builders did their jobs well. Despite attacks and lengthy sieges, again, no enemy ever took the fort by force. Each time the Castillo changed hands, it came about through treaty and negotiation, not combat. In fact, over the decades, the fort has changed ownership some 6 times by 4 different governments: Spain, Great Britain, the United States, as well as the Confederate States of America during the Civil War. All have called it their own at one time or another. You know, just a few short years after her completion, she came under attack, and I mean by some formidable opponents. The first siege occurred in 1702, when the British attacked from Charleston. This siege would last some 51 days, but ended in Spanish victory. The British would try again in 1740. This time the attack came from Georgia. This siege carried on for 28 days, but also ended in Spanish victory. And then in 1812, Americans from Georgia attacked in what was known as the Patriot War. And this siege would last almost 6 months, but it too would end in Spanish victory. Experts say the 3 main factors that account for the long legacy of the Castillo's effective defense was its structure and design, its artillery and firearms, and its well-trained soldiers who manned the fort. And now let's have a closer look at those 3 factors, beginning on the outside in an area that you might think little about, the moat. One of the first lines of defense was its moat. And as you can see, the moat is dry, as it was back in the day, for the most part. They did have the option of actually flooding this, raising a seawall, and it would be filled with water. And they would do that at times, but most of the time they kept it dry, and here's why. This is where they kept their domestic animals as well as their food supply, their livestock. And during long sieges, usually the party that had the most resources would typically win, because sieges many times was about time. Who had the most ammunition, who had the most food, who had the most water. This area actually provided food for all the citizens who were inside the fort during a siege. So it was very key. The other key thing about having a good moat
is it prevents someone from getting a good run at the side of the wall with a battering ram or even into the door. So this was very, very key to its defenses. Now I'm going to show you another defense called the glacis, and that's right outside. Glacis are known as the sloping hills that help protect the foundation of the fort. And as you can see here, if you can tell, that's a nice sloping hill right there. And what that did is that prevented the enemy from being able to get to the foundation of your fort. At the same time, it provided cover and concealment for the Spanish soldiers moving around.
As an example of how the glacis provided concealment, Clay is just on the other side of the wall, and now she's walking up the stairs and in plain sight. But you can see how the glacis was extremely helpful for the fort's defense and security, as the soldiers were able to move around without being seen. And now let's have a look at the unique stone that the fort was made of.
Another layer of defense for the Castillo was what it was made of. This is coquina. Coquina is fossilized seashells that's been compressed in sand for thousands of years. The key to this was that it was soft enough to withstand cannonball and small firearms without being shattered. So if this was regular stone, it would literally break apart. But because coquina is fairly soft, it was able to absorb the cannonball hits, as you can see here, and not shatter. Now these walls in this fort is between 9 and 18 feet thick, so even if it penetrated a couple of feet, nothing to be worried about because they were so thick. So this is another fantastic security layer for this fort, and this is probably one of the reasons too that it was never captured in battle.
And not only are the walls very thick, they're also very high, some 33 feet. And now we look at what was called the hot shot furnace.
So this right here is an oven. And what the Spanish did, they would heat their cannonball to glowing hot fire, shoot them through the cannons, hit the wooden ships out here that were trying to attack them, and it literally caused the ship to catch on fire.
And now let's enter the actual fort and take a look at how they protected the weakest part of the fort, its front door.
Okay, so now we're on top of the ravelin, which is another layer of defense for the Castillo fort. The reason they built this ravelin here is because it helped protect the weakest part of a fort, which is that wooden door right over there. So they had the ravelin here to help protect it from fire. There's also a couple other safety measures for that door. There's a big drawbridge that actually could raise it up. So let's go down now and take a look at that weakest, most vulnerable part of the fort. And here's that first drawbridge that we talked about. This is one they would raise up to help protect the wooden doors just inside here at the Sallyport.
And as we enter into the actual fort, the wooden door you see here is not the original. However, this is. It's now protected by glass. And you can see how thick it was. And now let's walk upstairs to the top and see what views the soldiers had when serving here. And there's the ravelin that we were just on top of that protected the front door. Being on top does provide a superb vantage point to the city as well as the ocean and the Matanzas River. And here is an overview of the courtyard, which is where the soldiers would conduct many of the drills and other training. It actually even housed the governor's home at one point when it was larger, prior to adding on to the fort.
So we're up on what's called the gun deck of the fort, and this is another one of those layers of security that helped this thing survive all the battles. You can see these cannons behind us here. At one point, the gun deck had over 60 cannons on it.
Bronze and cast iron cannons were the most powerful and longest range weapons in the Castillo. Their cannons had ranges from 1.5 miles up to 3 miles, with cannonballs ranging from 6 pounds up to 30 pounds, and many times not the typical cannonball you may think of. They had what was called the bar shot, the chain shot, the Spanish or spike shot, and an assortment of other items that proved to be very effective against invaders.
So one of the other things that really helped this fort be successful in battle was its 4 different bastions that they're called. We're on top of one right now. It's at those star points that you'll see from the sky.
Using the bastion design was very defensive thinking for the time, You see, each corner was protected by dozens of cannons. Each corner covered their approach to the fort with deadly interlocking fields of fire. If one cannon failed, there were others covering the same ground and target area. Each cannon had a crew made up of 4 soldiers and a commander, and they drilled constantly so as to have no mistakes while under attack. A quick look at where the sentries could position themselves for protection during inclement weather, as well as provide concealment from attackers. And when they observed trouble coming, they would alert the city by ringing the bell that was located inside the bell tower. This is the area where they have their historic weapons demonstration, where they actually simulate firing the cannons. It's pretty cool if you get a chance to see it. Now let's have a look inside the fort, where the Spanish soldiers resided.
So this is where the living quarters of where the soldiers would come when they would do their shifts. Soldiers back in the Spanish era didn't actually live here. They lived in town with their families, but they would come here for their shifts, which are typically around 24 to 48 hours. And this is their sleeping areas during that time while they were on duty. And here's the kitchen, the simple area beside the fireplace and the little table that they would eat, prepare their meals, and break bread right here.
Adjacent to this sleeping area was another room where carvings of what is said to be Spanish ships, along with other writings. And this room also had a very large fireplace. The fort even had a prison inside of it for those who were captured or otherwise wouldn't comply. And if you were wondering about their water supply,
So this place had several wells to sustain the people that stayed here. As a matter of fact, 6 feet under, there is still water, fresh water.
this is a look at one of the 28 casemates, rooms if you will, that are inside the fort. Many would have looked very similar to this one, storing supplies, food, firewood, and those are the tools that were used for the cannons that we saw earlier. And here, another one. Again, most of the rooms here inside the fort were very similar to this one and the one I showed you before. All having very nice exhibits about the history of the fort and the people who came through the doors. And as you can see, there's nothing fancy about living inside of a stone fort. And now let's have a quick look at some of the other rooms. This room had an interesting artifact from 1702.
This is a cannon that was actually fired during the 1702 siege, and it exploded. It killed 3 of the 4 guys that were trying to shoot it. But this is a 3,000-pound cannon. Can you imagine the force that's required to cause it to explode like that?
And here's a theater with more about the history of the fort. It's actually very good, so if you get a chance to visit, stop by and watch some of it. And this room gives us a glimpse of how the British living quarters were arranged during their occupation of the fort.
So we're now inside of the chapel, one of 2 chapels here at the fort, because the Spanish were devout Catholics. And right up here, they believe it used to be a crucifix here hanging, and then right here to the side on the walls, beautiful areas where they used to have their holy water. So religion was very, very important to the Spanish back in the days. And this is their chapel. Pretty cool.
And here's some very old etching on the wall. One here from 1880 and 1883, 1884. You just wonder what it was like back then. And you'll notice in many of the rooms there'll be these what appear to be wooden rafters that used to extend across. It's believed that during the British occupation they actually created 2 stories in many of these rooms. And here's another casemate, again filled with historical information about the fort. This dark room was their first powder room. It's where they kept their gunpowder, but because coquina is a porous material, the room would become damp, and so they had to construct other rooms for their powder, but this was their very first. At one time it was filled with trash and closed off, but later reopened. And the last room I'll show you, well, that's where they kept the king's treasure, waiting to be shipped back to Spain. You notice it had a pretty thick door as well. Well, the few hours that we've spent here at the Castillo de San Marcos Fort has been simply amazing. If you ever make it to St. Augustine, make sure you put this on your list of things to do. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Tolleson Life. As always, we appreciate you watching. Until next time, be well and stay safe.